Good evening, dear colleagues, dear friends. It's really great pleasure to see the full house tonight, and my big honor to welcome you at the continuation of the public program of the Kyiv Biennial here in Berlin at KV, titled A Bird That Cannot Land. The program, a discursive program that we started actually yesterday. The live program, just to remind you, will kick off tomorrow afternoon. And for that matter, I would again like to express my deep gratitude to the funders of this Kyiv Biennial edition. First of all, the Kulturstiftung des Bundes for kindly supporting the whole project, and also special thanks to the Bundeszentrale für politische Bildung for supporting the discursive program that we curated together with my colleague Trin Metzler. My name is Vasil Cherepanin. I represent the Kyiv Biennial. Tonight, it's really great pleasure to be in this company. It's a twofold event. On the one hand, it's a book launch of the publication which was edited by our colleague, editor and cultural researcher from Berlin, Philipp Goll, titled The Other Side of the Pipeline. On the other hand, this event is directly related to the Gesamtinstallation that we feature as part of the Kyiv Biennial exhibition here on the first floor, which was co-authored by the collective who also contributed to the book. Philip will kindly introduce our guest speakers, but I would like again to express my deep thankfulness to all of you that you so kindly agreed to take part in our program today. So this book and this installation is based on a long-run research on Russian colonialism and inter-imperial gas pipelines between back then West Germany and Soviet and then independent Russian so-called Federation, which we first featured last year within the Kyiv Biennial iteration at the Museum of Modern Art in Warsaw in 2025. And I'm really happy that we managed to get this installation this year here in Berlin in the context exactly that has to learn a lot from this project. And I'm also happy because it has a kind of a historical significance, because it's not just that the very first event of the Kyiv Biennial that we organized was in 2015 in August in Berlin, not far from here actually at the Polish Institute, but also that the very first event of the Kyiv Biennial in August 2015 in Kyiv itself, it was a presentation by Hito Steyerl of the project The Tower, which was done in cooperation with Oleksiy Radynski, who is also with us here. So it's again a great pleasure that we are reconvening today. The LEAG project is basically researching almost a traditional problematic field, namely the link between imperialism and capitalism. I am almost tempted to slightly paraphrase the classic that indeed imperialism is the highest stage of petrocapitalism. It's just a big question why Europe needs another genocidal war to understand this truth. This project is especially important for the Kyiv Biennial from the artistic point of view, not only because the problem of imperial erasure and neglect is worth researching, but also for the sake of art stricto sensu, because all of those German-Russian infrastructural gas energy deals were pretty often adorned with cultural events and with art exhibitions sponsored by energy firms from both countries, basically turning art into obscene circus, into a kind of a pseudo-Barockian accompaniment serving today's fascistoid oligarchy. So today indeed is a high time to do exact opposite, which is putting this energy colonialism and its criminal infrastructure into artistic investigation. I'm really happy that we have this project as part of the Kyiv Biennial, because I do believe that this is politics of art at its purest. So the structure of today's evening will be as follows: that first we have the panel discussion and exchange for around 70 minutes or so. Then we will have a short 15 minutes break to readjust the setting here. And afterwards we will have the screening of the last film by Oleksiy Radynski called Special Operation, after which we will have also an exchange with the artists. Thank you so much again for coming today. I wish you a nice evening, and I am happy to pass the microphone to Philipp Goll. Please give our guests a very warm welcome. Thank you.
Thanks, Vasil, for this kind introduction, and I'm quite overwhelmed by your presence. Yeah, because this is a super important project for me, and I think it's really needed in Berlin and in Germany to talk about all these topics on which we are touched upon in the installation. And thanks, Vasil and Trin, for organizing this, and also thanks to our translators who make possible that we all understand each other tonight. And yeah, as I said, it's super important here in Berlin to talk once more about Russian colonialism, the devastating effects of the exploitation of fossil fuels, and especially German complicity in this violent history. And this is important because we see every day an increasing repression of indigenous people in Russia, as we can also see on Tjan's T-shirt, for example. And we maybe read, and you read maybe in different media, the last incidents of repression in Russia, namely in Yakutia, where activists were raided yesterday and this week. And also it is important to stress once more that we have still an ongoing import of gas from Russia. In this time it's LNG coming from the Yamal Peninsula every day, and it's up to 10% of German consumption of gas. And this is also thanks to our Minister of Economic Affairs, Katharina Reiche, who was the CEO of one of the biggest German gas network operators, which is called West Energy. And also I would like to stress it is important to talk here in Berlin about Russian and also Soviet colonialism, because on demonstrations you can see still frequently people waving flags with emblems of Soviet Union to stress their stance in imperialist and in anti-imperialist and anti-colonialist terms. And we need to talk about all this urgently. This event, Vasil described it already. It's not only a book release, it's also about our long and enduring research on this topic. And I would like to invite you to talk not only to one of the contributors of the book, but also to Oleksiy Radynski and Hito Steyerl, and to answer questions about this process, which we started actually in 2023 or even before, but we showed the first result in the Museum der Bildenden Künste in Leipzig, where we presented the installation Leak for the first time. And the book I'm talking about, Leak, The Other Side of the Pipeline, contains not only materials from the project, but also parts of a workshop we organized where we invited, for example, Tjan, Zaochnaja, and Johannes Rohr, and also Svetlana Medvedenko, who's here with us today, to write articles about the legal situation of indigenous people in Russia, but also inter-imperial infrastructures between Siberia and Europe. And you can buy today this book, thoughtfully designed by Ukrainian designer Ulyana Buchenkova and published by the Hamburg publisher adocs, down at the bookstore later. And I hope you enjoy this, and or maybe not. Maybe in this topic it's maybe complicated to enjoy, but I think you can find some interesting things. Please let me introduce briefly our panelists tonight, and I would like to start with Oleksiy, because I'm extremely glad that he safely arrived from Kiev this week. Oleksiy is based in Kiev and is a filmmaker and writer, and his films are presented at several film festivals, Berlinale International Film Festival Rotterdam and Kurzfilmtage Oberhausen, and they won numerous awards, and especially Where Russia Ends, which is part of our installation downstairs on the first floor, won a lot of prizes in Ukraine. I wonder why. Oleksiy is probably widely known in Germany because of his seminal essay on Russian colonialism, published in eFlux 2024 under the title The Case Against Russian Federation, which was translated in taz by myself. Wider die russische Föderation. I highly recommend to read this. It's online accessible. Since 2008, he's also engaged in the VCR, in the Visual Center for Cultural Research in Kiev, and is founding member of the group Kinotron, which is also the producer of Where Russia Ends, his film. Welcome. With us is luckily also Hito Steyerl, filmmaker and writer, and widely shown at exhibitions in Europe and worldwide. And Hito's work, as you see downstairs perfectly, address media, technology, and the global circulation of images through video installation and digital environments. Hito recently published a book under the title Medium Hot, Images in the Age of Heat, a collection of the newest writings. And Hito is professor of emergent digital media at the Academy of Fine Arts in Munich. And at the moment, she's working on a retrospective at Kunsthalle Hamburg, which will open in October. And also I want to express my deep gratitude tonight to Hito, since she's also the enabler, or let's say the wielder, as we joke, because she connected all the parts nicely in this exhibition, in this installation. And without her dedication to keep up with artistic means, with current political events in the world, and her curiosity, we weren't sitting here, I think. Thank you. And last not least, I welcome Tjan Zaochnaja, who came today from Munich. And Tjan is a human rights activist who advocates the rights of indigenous people suppressed by Soviet and today's Russia, and especially the Itelmen people from the peninsula Kamchatka since the 80s. And in the 80s, she was expelled from Soviet Union and has been informing the German public since then about the impact of resource extraction on indigenous people's way of life in Siberia. And she's also the first writer who informed in German language about these problems, because she wrote a lot of articles in the journal Pogrom, and I highly recommend to go to Staatsbibliothek Berlin when you're in Berlin, because there, Pogrom, all the issues are stored. You can access it there and take a Saturday off and read through all the issues from the 90s. Tjan hosts a monthly radio show on Radio Lora, Munich, and is a member of the Society for Threatened People, die Gesellschaft für bedrohte Völker, and among other exiled activists, part of the International Committee of Indigenous People of Russia, ICPR. Welcome, Tjan. Yeah, I would like to start with you, Oleksiy, because you did a lot of research into the development of the Nord Stream pipeline, and we draw a lot on this research. And I remember when Nord Stream was discussed in German media, it was long before the full-scale invasion, and even before the annexation of Crimea in 2014. I didn't really care about some Baltic pipeline. Why did you turn to this topic?
First of all, thanks for having me and for the introduction and for this question. So I should say I would definitely prefer to not be interested in Nord Stream and things like that, because like it's a pipeline. I mean, it's filled with gas. I mean, there are so many things in the world that are much more exciting, but at some point it seemed that Nord Stream is interested in me, in a way, because for a lot of us, I mean, in Ukraine, it's been clear quite early from the start that if Nord Stream happens, this means war. Yeah, and now I don't want to sound like a self-fulfilling prophecy, but it's been clear to quite a lot of people in Ukraine, because in this kind of inter-imperial architecture that emerged on the continent after the Cold War, Ukraine, and we knew that, had been given only one real kind of geopolitical role, sadly, yeah, and this was the role of a transit zone for fossil fuels, yeah, a transit zone for oil and gas that from the site of their extraction, yeah, in the occupied lands of indigenous peoples of Siberia, the illegally occupied lands by the Russian Federation. So from that sites all over to Western Europe, to the sites of their kind of release into the atmosphere, and yeah, the burning of this oil and gas. So when it became clear that what's going on, and this was happening through the territory of Ukraine, of course, through the pipelines that were built jointly by the Soviet Union and West Germany, yeah, which is the subject, one of the subjects of our research and installation that you can see downstairs. So when it transpired that now there will possibly be a different route and from Russia to Germany directly, this pipeline, as we discovered during our research, is going to be the new wall. Yeah, it's going to be like the new, sort of a new Berlin Wall that will kind of return that part of, like our part of the world, into Russia's orbit, because this only real geopolitical, so to say, meaning of Ukraine as a state entity will be lost. I mean, when I say the only meaning, I mean in this inter-imperial vision, of course, and not the rest. Yeah, and it was really unclear why is this happening, and why it is not clear for people in Germany, for example, yeah, that this is going to be the result. And I thought I found an answer to this when I heard a statement by Angela Merkel, who at some point said about Nord Stream, well, this is just an economic project. And I'm from Ukraine, and we know things about corruption, yeah? We can smell corruption. We've been lectured about corruption, profoundly. So we know that when a politician is saying like, oh, this is purely economic project, this means someone's been paid a bribe, most likely. Yeah, I mean, this just doesn't happen like that. And this was one thing. Then, in a way, Nord Stream, because there's more than one Nord Stream, as we now know, or there was more than one Nord Stream, is actually also a product of war. Because the war of Russia against Ukraine started in 2014, as we know, and the deal to build Nord Stream 2, after Nord Stream 1 has been completed, had been signed in 2015. So already after the annexation of Crimea, and already after the launching of the war in Donbass, so we could say that Russia was rewarded by the German government for starting a war against Ukraine in this kind of policy of appeasement and so on. As a result, we have this really schizophrenic situation since 2022 that, as is now clear, due to this fossil fuel architecture and the fact that the Russian war machine has become possible due to these enormous payments for fossil fuels from Germany and other countries, that it is the European Union that has been funding the Russian war against Ukraine for a very long time and is still doing this, as you rightly mentioned. We even know that as of 2024, the amount of so-called aid to Ukraine has been smaller financially than the amount paid for Russian fossil fuels by Germany and overall the countries of the EU, which is, I don't have words for this, so I should probably stop. I should just say that this war will also not stop until the European side continues paying for the Russian war machine. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. This is, for me, this project is so important because I had to learn so many things and also to unlearn a lot of things. Because especially I recognized that all the things you are talking about and more like about the broader context of Russian colonialism, in my academic education in Slavic studies, we didn't talk about indigenous people in Russia, about the more than 100 different groups with their language, cultures, and so on. And this was super surprising for me, and I had to go to all of this from the beginning and try to educate myself. And thanks to activists like Tjan, I learned a lot about all these things, and especially what I'm also discovered on this research was that Germany was complicit also in the colonial exploitation and discovery, because a lot of researchers, German researchers, went to Siberia to do some work in the 80s and 19th century, and it's there's one place more. And luckily, since the full-scale invasion, a lot of new projects came up, and I just want to make one example of an event which took place not long ago at Spore initiative, organized by Tanya Sokolnikova, Natalia Stupka, and Maria Vorotilina, who exactly talked about the topic of Russian colonialism mainly in Central Asia, and also some colleagues from the collective decolonized language published a book on the current state of indigenous people, and you can also buy this book downstairs in the shop. It's donation based, and I highly recommend to have a look because there are a lot of activists writing about their situation. And also I would like to recommend this book on Russian colonialism by Maxim Eristavi, who wrote in detail about the atrocities of Russian colonists against indigenous people in Siberia. And from our conversations, Hito, I understand that you also went through a learning process. And I would like to ask you, what was for you the most interesting discovery on this research? And did you find some blind spots you would like to talk about?
Well, first of all, thanks again for having me. Thanks to the Kiev Biennial for giving me the opportunity to, after almost 15 years, in a way, renew the kind of collaboration. Also with Oleksiy, we were working together since more than 10 years, so it's a great, I think this is also the reason why we embarked on this project in the first place. And I come from it from a different angle. I'm interested in images, I'm interested in technology. When we did a film in 2015 in Kharkiv, it was about a gaming company that was situated in Kharkiv, which did emergency simulators in game engines, basically, and online casinos. And they were already preparing for a potential invasion at that point in time. So this is how basically I entered this picture. I learned, of course, a lot, if I may say a few words about the way we collaborated. Basically, there was a research pool with many materials that Oleksiy collected, that you, Philipp, collected, and that led, of course, to a lot of discussions and debates. And for me, the most interesting thing was also issued from that kind of quip you already mentioned, Oleksiy, how the pipeline, which is supposed to be connecting, how that was a barrier in many places, actually. There is this song by the DDR workers downstairs which says this explicitly. It has the chorus line, our barricade is the track. The track is a barricade, right? So basically the thing that is supposed to connect is a barrier at the same time. And I think around this dialectics, a lot of thoughts developed. You know, for example, I realized that this pipeline which was supposed to connect was in fact like a one-way mirror, and people did not see beyond any sort of national boundary or border to see what the other people that were supposedly connected to the pipeline were doing, what kind of situation they're in, what kind of historical, political, and so on context there was. Everything was kept extremely isolated, which was the more surprising, as you know, the pipeline even went through the Berlin Wall, which was not really very leaky, honestly, but the gas had no problem going through, right? So the gas was flowing. The people had no idea that they were being connected. I had really no clue that the gas I'm cooking with came from the Jamal Island, the Bahar Peninsula. There was no discourse around it. But the thing which really fascinated me, because I'm a person that works with images, is that gas was flowing in one direction and in the other art was flowing, right? So there was this basically circulation of images whereby fossil fuel came into one direction, and then there was a so-called cultural pipeline which was bi-directional, which consisted of large blockbuster exhibitions co-organized by the Soviet Ministry for Culture and the Deutsche Bank, Mannesmann and other corporations, which is already a very interesting curatorial team, I should say. But they were, having all these big shows about historical masterworks, blah, 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 and so on, until quite recently, I should say, I think 2011 or so, there's a sort of chronology in our film downstairs. So that went on for quite a long time. The fossils are flowing basically in the underground, the art is flowing overground, and basically there is this kind of circulation of images and fossils which keeps people apart from another. And how apart, that was really not too apparent to me. In another discussion, I found the term of fractal colonialism for it, right? That basically the pipeline in every area it went through triggered some kind of, processes of oppression, which basically went down almost in a fractal way without people, knowing each other's situation across the borders. That was maybe the most striking result for me.
Thank you. Yeah, it's also something Svetlana Matvienko touches upon in her essay in the book, and it's about like how imperia work with each other and how they exclude. That imperia integrate a lot of people, but in a way that they can't really have an agency. They are rather put against each other in this in trans-imperial relations. And on a practical level, you, Tjan, you experienced it in your time still in living in Soviet Union. When we met for the first time, when I organized this first screening after the full-scale invasion and after I got to know more about Russian colonization, and I was looking for activists who are dealing with the topic of indigenous resistance in Soviet Union, and you were actually expelled from Soviet Union in the 80s, and but I'm wondering if you could tell a bit more how your ancestors from the so-called Far East, which is already a very colonial term because it's Moscow-centered, and it's not a description coming from the East, it's rather from the Moscow point of view, and how your ancestors told you about their history, actually, or how in Itelmen sources, how they deal with their history.
Vielen herzlichen Dank. Tjan, ich begrüße Sie alle. Ich bin ein bisschen nervös, weil ich bin eigentlich eine Straßenkämpferin in München. Ja, ich erzähle Menschen auf der Straße oder bei Tollwut oder kleinen Kreisen. Oder ich protestiere. Ich habe ja auch protestiert, als zum Beispiel 2005 Nord Stream 1 zwischen Putin und Schröder unterschreiben sollte. Wir haben protestiert mit der Gesellschaft für bedrohte Völker. Leider haben sie einen anderen Weg genommen und deshalb haben wir die beiden nicht gesehen.
Thank you very much and also welcome on my part. I have to say I am a bit nervous because normally I'm more of a street fighter in Munich where I live. I like to speak to people on the street or also in other settings. And I spend time protesting. And one of the occasions when I protested was in 2005, when Nord Stream 1 was to be signed by Putin and Schröder at the time. And we had set up our protest with the Society for Threatened Peoples. But then, unfortunately, Putin and Schröder didn't pass us on their route.
Aber gestatten Sie mir bitte, einen kurzen historischen Blick nur auf Kamtschatka zu machen, weil verschiedene Völker wurden ja unterschiedlich auch kolonisiert, aber ich begrenze mich nur auf Kamtschatka.
And I will briefly talk about the history of just Kamchatka, and we have to keep in mind that different peoples were colonized in different ways.
Ich will auch sagen, dass in der Sowjetunion, ich war ja dort geboren und bin in die Schule gegangen, habe sogar auch gearbeitet. Das Thema Kolonisation, Kolonisierung, Kolonialismus war nie in unserem Schulprogramm.
And I can tell you that in the Soviet Union, where I was born, I went to school and I also started working, terms like colonization or colonialism never came up in our school curriculum.
Auch in den Bibliotheken in Kamtschatka konnte man überhaupt nicht finden, vielleicht in der größten Bibliothek in der Stadt Petropavlovsk, aber ich bin aus einem kleinen Dorf und deshalb in unserer Bibliothek, Schulbibliothek, gab es sowas nicht.
And even in the libraries of Kamchatka, you wouldn't find any information on those terms. I mean, maybe in the capital, Petropavlovsk, but that's not where I lived. I lived in a little village, and in our library there would have been nothing.
Ich habe mich mit dem Thema Kolonialismus erst im 1983 intensiv beschäftigt, als ich mich für ein Kolloquium in Paris 500 Jahre Kolonisation Sibirien teilgenommen habe. Nein, nicht 5, sondern 400. Entschuldigung. Meine mathematische Begabung.
And I only started dealing with the topic of colonialism in 1983 when I visited a colloquium in Paris that was on 400 years of colonialism in Siberia.
Und ich habe dort auch sehr viele Wissenschaftlerinnen und Wissenschaftler kennengelernt, aber auch Nicht-Wissenschaftlerinnen und so. Und in Bayern gibt es ja so eine tolle Bibliothek und man konnte wirklich tolle Sachen finden. Und deshalb musste ich selbst die Geschichte meiner Vorfahren lernen.
And in Paris, I met a lot of scientists, but also non-scientists. But I also have to say, in Bavaria, where I live, there is a great library with excellent information on this topic. And I have to say, because you asked about my ancestors, I had to study and start studying the history myself.
Und in den 90er Jahren dürfte ich ja wieder nach Russland fahren. Und ich habe ja auch was ich in der Bibliothek oder von anderen Menschen bekommen habe, was die Geschichte betrifft zu meinem Volk, was die Sprache betrifft, habe ich ja das mit Menschen auch geteilt.
And then in the 1990s, I was again allowed to travel to Russia, and everything that I had read in the libraries about my people and my language, I then shared with the people in Russia.
Und hier im Saal sitzt Dr. Erich Kasten, der seit 1993 sehr intensiv mit Inter-Imperialen, auch anderen Völkern auf Kamtschatka gearbeitet hat und arbeitet weiter. Und deshalb, mein Horizont war auch etwas erweitert. Und deshalb möchte ich ja gerne nur kurz die historischen Sachen jetzt vorlesen, damit Sie verstehen, was die Italiener erlebt haben.
And then there's also Dr. Erich Kasten here in this room. I've known him since 1993, and he's done a lot of work on the Itelmen, but also on other peoples, and I learned a great deal from him. And now I would like to take this opportunity to briefly read you a short history of the Itelmen people.
1697 ist das offizielle Jahr der Eroberung Kamtschatkas.
So 1697 is the official year of the conquest of Kamchatka.
In den 330 Jahren erlitten die Italiener Folgendes. Die Eroberung, wie die von Aufständen begleitet wurde.
And this is what happened in the following 330 years. First of all, the conquest that was also accompanied by insurgencies.
Die gewaltsame Zwingung der Italiener zur Beförderung der Expedition von Vitus Bering innerhalb Kamtschatkas.
And then the Itelmen were forced to support the expedition of Vitus Bering in Kamchatka.
Gewaltsame Christianisierung, angeschleppte Krankheiten, Epidemien.
Then forced Christianization, imported diseases and epidemics.
Zwangsumsiedlungen sowohl in der Zarenzeit als auch in der Sowjetzeit.
Forced resettlements, both in the Tsarist era, but also in the Soviet Union.
Die Russen benannten unsere Flüsse, unsere Berge, unsere Vulkane nach ihrem Geschmack um.
The Russians renamed our rivers, our mountains, and our volcanoes as they liked.
Unser größter Fluss mit schönem Namen Uikoal wurde als Kamtschatka genannt.
And our biggest river, bearing the beautiful name of Uikoal, was called Kamchatka.
Aber das war nicht alles. Die Italiener erlitten gewaltsame Umbenennung zunächst zu Kamtschadalen und 1926 wurden die Kamtschadalen offiziell als Russen registriert.
But that wasn't all. The Itelmens were forcibly renamed into Kamchadals, and then later, after 1926, they were again registered as Russians.
Auch italienische Namen wurden uns untersagt. Alle haben russischen und deshalb habe ich auch einen russischen Namen und alle meine Verwandten und viele Italiener.
Itelmen names were prohibited. Everybody had to have a Russian name, and this is also why I, my family, my friends, we all have Russian names.
Die Repressionen der 1930er Jahre gingen auch an den Italienern nicht spurlos vorbei.
And of course also the repression of the 1930s left a mark on the Itelmens.
Bereits in den ersten 40 Jahren der Eroberung verringerte sich die Zahl der Italiener auf Kamtschatka um das 12. bis 15-fache. Es ist die Schätzung von dem Wissenschaftler Georg Wilhelm Steller, der von 1740 bis 1744 auf Kamtschatka tätig war.
And it was already in the first 40 years of the conquest that the number of Itelmens on Kamchatka was reduced down to 1/12 or 1/15 even. And this is an estimation made by the scientist Georg Wilhelm Steller, who did research on Kamchatka between 1740 and 1744.
Die Zuwanderung aus anderen Regionen Russlands und der ehemaligen Sowjetunion führte dazu, dass die Ureinwohner Kamtschatkas, das sind die Italiener, Koryaken, Aleuten, Evenen und andere, prozentual geschehen zu einer Minderheit geworden sind.
And because of the immigration from other parts of Russia and also the former Soviet Union, the number of indigenous people, or people who were indigenous in Kamchatka, like the Itelmens, Koryaks, Aleuts, Yevens, were reduced to a minority in terms of percentage.
Während sie 1926 noch 64% ausmachten, waren es 1989 nur noch 2%.
If there were still 64% in 1926, they were only 2% in 1989.
Diese Prozesse wurden intensiviert in der Sowjetzeit während der Industrialisierung der Fischerei und Landwirtschaft und der Militarisierung der Halbinsel.
And these processes were particularly intensive in the time of the Soviet Union, during industrialization of fisheries and forestry, and also the militarization of the peninsula.
All dies führte zum Verlust vom Land, zum Verlust der traditionellen Lebensweise, zum Verlust der Identität, zum Verlust der intermenischen Sprache, zum Verlust des historischen Gedächtnisses.
And all of this led to a loss of land, a loss of traditional lifestyles, loss of identity, loss of Itelmen language, and the loss of the historical memory.
Das war nicht zu 100%, aber am meisten sozusagen.
So maybe it wasn't 100%, but this was the most extreme part.
Mein Vater war Jäger, meine Großmutter war Heilerin, sie war auch Hebamme, sie war auch Wettervorhersagerin, aber ohne Diplome. Meine Großmutter und meine Mutter, die waren Sammlerinnen von Wildpflanzen und verschiedenen Beeren. Und auch wenn ich und meine Geschwister, wir waren ja Internatskinder, doch sie konnten uns etwas noch beibringen, was ihre Vorfahren und Vorfahren sozusagen, was sie gemacht haben, trotz auch 2 Umsiedlungen. Ich habe in meinem Leben selber 2-mal gezwungene Umsiedlungen erleben musste. Ja.
My father was a hunter. My grandmother was a healer. She was also a midwife and also a meteorologist, although she didn't have a diploma. And my mother and my father together, my mother also was, together with my grandmother, let's say a gatherer of wild plants and berries. And although my siblings were sent to boarding school, I still had the opportunity to learn from my parents and from my ancestors. And I have to say, I was myself forcibly resettled on 2 occasions.
Und zuletzt will ich ja sagen, Perestroika hat ja auch Kamtschatka erreicht. Und viele Menschen dort haben angefangen, auch zum Thema Kolonisation zu denken. Sie haben ja auch im 1991 haben sie auch eine Deklaration zur Unabhängigkeit sozusagen geschrieben. Ich habe mich auch beworben, dort im Ministerium für Außenministerium beworben, aber leider habe ich ja keine Antwort bekommen. Und im 1997, das war 97, ja, haben die Itelmenen 300-jähriges Jubiläum des Anschluss Kamtschatka an Russland nicht mitfeiern wollten. Das war doch, ich meine, man hat ja nicht zu 100% von den Menschen diese, wie sagt man, kulturelle, aber auch politische Gedanken nicht ausgerottet.
And perestroika also came to Kamchatka, and that was a time when people did start to think about colonization and colonialism. And in 1991, there was even a declaration of independence that was written, at least, and I also applied to work in what would be the future foreign ministry, but unfortunately I never got an answer to my application. And then in 1997, the Itelmen said that they wouldn't celebrate their 300 years of accession to Russia. And I think that resistance tells you that in spite of everything, it hasn't been possible to fully eradicate political thinking in that region.
Thank you. Thank you for describing in detail. And of course, I would like to deepen this conversation and go into more details, but I also would like to take the advantage of the opportunity to talk with Oleksiy about his work, because a lot of the topics Tjan mentioned now are also raised in the film you made in Where Russia Ends. We even traveled to Kamchatka and see some footage from there. But since it's quite complex, I really would like to know more about these images, and where do you found these images, and how did you work with them?
Yeah, thanks. Sorry. This film is a result of research that is based on various types of sources. So, first of all, maybe even more fundamentally, these are the sources, the historical sources about the Russian colonization of Siberia. The sources that are unfortunately really scarce, because this colonization has been perpetrated with such extreme cruelty that even the memory about these events have been kind of almost erased from the memory. Yeah, and unlike most of the other empires that at least on some level had to reckon with their colonial pasts, Russia, as we know, did not do this and is not going to do this. Also partly because it has erased the memory of these multiple genocides and massacres and wars that it has perpetrated on these lands. But still these resources exist. Yeah, and some of them are even here with us. This book by Zeev Wolfson that is written under the name, under the surname Boris Komarov in the 70s, about the ecological disaster in Siberia and so on. Yeah, so that's one set of sources. The other set of sources is actually film sources that make up the structure of the film, and these were discovered when we were working with my film collective that includes Luba Knarazok, who is here, who actually also produced and narrated this film. We've been working with the abandoned film archive of one of the film studios in Kyiv called the Science Film Studio. And when we were sipping through this kind of abandoned, forgotten film reels produced at this studio by the Ukrainian filmmakers in the 1980s, I discovered a strangely significant number of film reels shot by these filmmakers in Siberia. Mostly documentary footage that was, as this film studio had to be part basically of Soviet propaganda machine, promoting the extractivist industry in Siberia, the Soviet extractivist industry, But some of this footage drew my attention because it was actually clear that it was made without any intention of entering any film on the Soviet screen, because it wouldn't be possible to show this. This sort of images representing poverty, all sorts of deprivation and so on. And I started to think, like, why in Kyiv this film studio had to do this, and why filmmakers from Ukraine had been sent to Siberia in the 1980s. And one of the answers was, of course, this notion that Hito introduced to us, fractal colonialism. So when the colonized nation is used against the other colonized nation, already as a perpetrator of the colonial project, but then on a more profound level of Ukrainian history, it became clear that we also have to accept the fact as Ukrainians that we had not only been the victims of Russian colonialism, we had at some point become also its perpetrators. Yes, and since the 17th century, immediately after the subjugation of then Ukrainian territory, Ukrainian Cossacks were immediately sent to Buryatia, for example, and the first kind of avant-garde of the Tsarist army in various places in Siberia were Ukrainians, and this was all what often happens in imperial colonial histories.
Even to Kamchatka, right?
Up all the way to Kamchatka. And in the 80s, of course, this this film studio that was part of the Soviet propaganda machine, that was part of a colonially subjugated Soviet Ukraine, had produced these images that we kind of had to reinvent and revisit from a sort of a decolonial perspective. And this is basically the core idea of the film.
And you referred to the film once as a decolonial road movie. How you came up with this idea? What does it mean for you, decolonial road movie?
It is what it is. Yeah, it's a blurb for a film. I mean, it is a road movie because it's based on several film expeditions. Yeah, several film trips. Some of these film trips were for the films that were made or that we know that were made, and some of this footage was discovered as rushes. Yeah, as raw unedited footage for the films that we don't know, if they even existed. Yeah, they probably were either censored or cancelled or by the film industry in the 80s. But they represent the trips. Mm-hmm. So technically, it's a road movie, but it's also decolonial for the reasons that are the content of the film.
Thanks. Thanks for the insights. And I mean, we could talk about the entire installation now with the 5th channel of Hito, with the about Nord Stream, which is also footage which you found, right, on the website of Nord Stream. But I really would like to point out more the new part of the installation, which is the new commission by the Kiev Biennial, concerned with the workers at the pipeline from the former GDR, because as we learned in the research, pipelines are made by human, and they were sent by the GDR to Ukraine and also Soviet Russia. And I would like to ask you, Hito, if you could recapitulate how this work came into life and was integrated into the installation.
Well, I think we already knew about that part before when we did the first, let's say, half of the installation, but at that time we weren't able to, open up another research. But when we opened the installation in Leipzig for the first time, basically the first person that came to see it was a member of the press, local press, and he had been one of the so-called Radynski. He had been in Ukraine, built the pipeline, and so on. And he was very vocal because he had a completely different memory, and he really wanted this history also to matter. And we thought that actually, we need to do it. This is a part that was missing at that time, and we also need to try to tell that story, which is what we tried to do. Philipp found 4 former Radynski, which, I mean, the basic deal is like this. The GDR was getting some gas off the pipeline, but they had to build it, right? They had to send people to build it. They had to send basically the equipment to build it, the engineers, and so on and so on. And build it is a bit of an overstatement. They built around a few hundred kilometers of it, mostly in the territory that is Ukraine. And there was a whole network of other pipelines that connected to it. And that was done in the scope of, at least in the beginning, something which was called a youth project, meaning that young people mostly were recruited out of enthusiasm to contribute to the economic, technological development of socialist states and basically build the pipeline. So Philipp found 4 people who had contributed in building it in the 70s, some of it in the late 70s, some of it in the later part in the 80s, where basically all this sort of ideological facade kind of fell apart and deteriorated and became more of a money-making project. But anyway, it was really interesting to talk to them, to see also the kind of, to be a to be a witness to the kind of feelings they had toward this project. Some of them still said, I mean, you have to imagine they were really young, they were, driving all this big machinery, they had a lot of responsibility, they were basically building this huge thing which they expected to do good things. So, but all of them were extremely reflective of, what this means today, and that from the point of view of today, neither technologically nor in any other sense, it would make sense to build another one today. So they said they were able to understand this project, let's say, out of the circumstances of the time, but that this time was past and that there was no way this would make any more sense. And I thought this is again one of the examples that I mentioned, right? So the money basically went to, most of it, to Wintershall, to Mannesmann, to Deutsche Bank. It was instigated, this deal, by a very shady person called Wolf von Amerongen, who was a big deal in 70s West German economic relations, a former Nazi who had basically started his career trading Aryanized stocks from Jews, and also already being active on the stock market. So this is where a lot of the money went, right? Then we had East Germans who went to Ukraine to build parts of the pipeline. We had Ukrainian filmmakers who went to Siberia, to record the lives of the people living there. And then we have the lives of the people on Jamal Island and otherwise that were affected on it in many ways, and none of them really knew a lot about one another. So this is why I think it's super important, especially also in Berlin, to finally connect all these parts and these different perspectives of the story. I have a I only gave a short summary. I think the engineers and the welders tell it in a much more rich and detailed way, so have a look at the small installation part that we did downstairs.
Yeah, and I think what is also crucial here, as we experienced it, because now I also remember that the guy came to us and was upset, actually, because again it was like this imposition of a West German perspective on a topic of East German history, because we came like very critical about all this pipeline construction, but it was part of their work, of their life, and they were super proud. And we are coming from this perspective and criticizing the colonial dimension, but we didn't reflect on it, how this could be for them to see how we perceived as West Germans came into this story and told this story in this way. And I think it's super important to tell this story of the pipelines from this angle also, the West German and the East German. And I'm happy that we could integrate this in the exhibition. Maybe there are already some questions in the audience. We could.
Maybe can I say something? Mm-hmm. Because I just saw the building of a new pipeline. Can you believe it? I was super surprised. I thought, no, that's not happening anymore. That's over now. No, it's not over. Why is it not over? Because of AI mainly. Not only of AI, but of huge energy needs, but also a geopolitical restructuring of the landscape. So I just went to Croatia, where there is a huge new AI data center projected to the tune of 50 billion. The whole area is being, powered up, as they say, connected to infrastructure. This new gas pipeline comes from the Adriatic. It has LNG from Qatar, and it connects to Hungary now, and it is newly built. I mean, now in 2026, a new pipeline with gas, is especially gas that has to pass the Strait of Hormuz. That was really, really a surprise to me. So, AI is basically a new consumer of energy. All sorts of fossil resources are being deployed. So this story is not over. New pipelines are being built and creating new kinds of dependency across, several kinds of continents, and there are new consumers in town. So that's for me basically the next stage of this fossil colonial story.
I have a question to Tjan. What is your wish, your utopia for Kamchatka, or how would you like to see the reality there?
Danke für die Frage. Ich glaube, auf Kamtschatka denkt man jetzt nicht mehr an die Utopie. Es war ja eine gewisse Zeit, 90er oder bis 2000, vielleicht 11, 12, dass die Menschen noch Träume hatten. Und als ich zum letzten Mal 2014 auf Kamtschatka war, da hat das Blatt schon sich gewendet und die Menschen haben ja wahrscheinlich Angst und sie wurden etwas, wie sagt man, stummer geworden.
Yes, thank you for the question. Today I don't think it makes a lot of sense to ask about dreams and utopias for Kamchatka. It was maybe between the 1990s and 2011 or 12 that people still had dreams. But then the last time I went, in 2014, things had already changed and people were different and people were afraid, and I think people were generally quieter about their dreams.
Wir haben ja, ich meine, die Gesellschaft für bedrohte Völker, Kulturstiftung Sibirien und viele anderen, ob das jetzt aus wissenschaftlichen Gremien oder Institutionen, auch Menschen hier in Deutschland, haben ja Menschen bei Projekten geholfen, die Tilmenen wollten, zum Beispiel wieder die Sprache erlernen, das nicht nur sozusagen in der Schule vielleicht in ersten 2, 3 Klassen, sondern auch Menschen, die nach der Arbeit oder vor der Arbeit. Wir haben ja auch geholfen beim Projekt, bei Fischerbootprojekt, und sie wollten Territorien zu traditionellen Naturnutzen gründen und haben sogar Tilmenen gegründet, aber es wurde ihnen wieder annulliert, ja. Sie wollten Territorien zu traditionellen Naturnutzen gründen.
There were several players like the Society for Threatened Peoples or the Foundation for the Siberian Culture, or be it economic institutions or people here in Germany in general who have supported projects in Kamchatka. Like, for example, for people who, Itelmens, for example, who wanted to relearn their language, and not just in school for 1 or 2 years, but maybe also as adults before they work in the morning or in the evening after work. So that has happened. Or there has been another project to again build traditional fisher boats. Or there has been a project to set up an organization for better natural use of the territory, but unfortunately that project then never came to pass.
Als ich 2014, das war meine letzte Reise nach Kamtschatka, war ich sehr überrascht, dass einige meiner Mitstreiterinnen und Mitstreiter und auch Freunde, die haben plötzlich sich sehr anders benommen. Ich dachte, was ist passiert? Und kurz vor meiner Abreise habe ich ja von ein paar Menschen aus verschiedenen Orten gesagt bekommen, sie werden von Geheimpolizei ausgefragt, worüber wir gesprochen haben. Und das hat mich hat mir wehgetan, weil ich habe sowas in den 70er Jahren noch in der Sowjetzeit erlebt. Und ich habe mich diesmal freiwillig von Kamtschatka verabschiedet. Und mit der totalen Krieg gegen die Ukraine haben ja meine Landsleute alle Kontakte mit mir persönlich abgebrochen. Und es tut mir auch sehr weh, dass meine Landsleute, auch sogar meine Verwandten, die gehen in die Ukraine und die töten dort die Menschen. Ja, deshalb bin ich ja jetzt wirklich sehr, sehr pessimistisch.
In 2014, which was my last trip to Kamchatka, I was there and I was a bit surprised that my, let's say, co-fighters from the past and my friends had really changed their behavior. And I was wondering what was going on. But then before I left, somebody told me that the secret police had interrogated them about the conversations I had had with them. And that was really painful for me because it reminded me of the 1970s and what it was like back then. So at least this time I left voluntarily. I was also, let's say, happy to leave. And since the full-scale Russian war on Ukraine started, my compatriots haven't really been speaking to me anymore. And it is saddening to see that they and also even parts of my family now kill people in Ukraine. And that makes me say that today I am rather pessimistic.
Und am 6. September 2025 wurde die unabhängige Bloggerin auf Kamtschatka unter Hausarrest gesetzt oder gestellt. Sie hat noch über die Situation der Indigenen auf Kamtschatka berichtet, aber sie hat ja wie die Daria Jägereva und Natalia Leongard, das sind diese indigenen Aktivistinnen, es droht ihr auch, dass sie unter dem, wie heißt das, Statja, Extremism, wie heißt das? Extremismusvorwurf vorgeworfen wird, ja, und es kann ja von 10 bis 20 Jahre sozusagen die Straflage sein.
On the 6th of September 2025, there was an independent blogger on Kamchatka who was put under house arrest. And like other indigenous activists also on Kamchatka, she might now be facing extremism charges, and that could potentially mean 10 to 20 years in prison.
Und diese Menschen, ich meine die und Natalia Leongard und Daria Jägereva, es tut mir leid. Ich möchte sogar weinen, es tut mir leid. Aber wissen Sie, ich habe und wahrscheinlich auch meine Landsleute, die indigenen Landsleute, die im Ausland sich befinden und wahrscheinlich auch Menschen, die in Russland leben, sie haben gedacht, wenn wir Indigenen dort, ich meine in Russland Lebende, nur über das Klima sprechen, nur über die Rechte der Indigenen, dass sie das Recht auf Fischfang, auf Rentierzucht, auf Sammeln und das Recht auf saubere Luft und Wasser haben, darüber sprechen. Es ist ja kein Separatismus, kein Terrorismus, aber bei 17 Menschen wurden Hausdurchsuchungen in ganzen Sibirien gemacht. 2 sitzen jetzt in Untersuchungshaft, ich habe schon hier gesagt. Und deshalb ist es wirklich sehr, sehr schwer zu sagen, was uns dort erwartet wird.
I have to say that I think my indigenous compatriots who live abroad, or maybe also in Russia, always thought that if indigenous people only talk, let's say, about the climate or the rights of indigenous people, like, for example, to fishing or reindeer herding or gathering or clean air or water, then it couldn't be called separatism, or we couldn't be blamed of terrorism. But then again, there were 17 people in Siberia whose houses were searched, and 2 of them are now on pre-trial detention. And all of that makes me think that the future is going to be very difficult.
Maybe there are more. There's more question.
Yes, good evening. I will have a question to Hito Steyerl for a remark that impressed me a lot about the meaning of the Nord Stream pipeline being at the same time or being something that was supposed to be connecting people, but by connecting, separating them, or more separating people by building a connection. And this is quite a philosophic dimension in this thought, I guess, which I cannot grasp the vastness of this idea now, but I immediately also, in relationship to your other work, had to think about the things that are supposed, or the media that is supposed to connect us, is also separating us on a certain level. So this is quite a huge and dystopic kind of thinking, if we're thinking about, let's say, the internet as an AI-based data pool. So that would mean that all our connections, our media connections, are also separating us. So I wanted to know if you can relate to this.
That's very kind, but Oleksiy said that. he is the author of that idea.
Then it's a question for Oleg.
No, but we can both answer, but I also have, we talked a lot about it, so I also have some ideas. For me, one of the interesting things, of course, was the stacking of pipelines, right? So you have this kind of original pipeline which transports energy, but then you have all sorts of digital pipelines that are based on that. And for those pipelines, basically similar things apply, whether it's a pipeline of digital communication, whether it's an AI pipeline which comes again on top of it. All of them are based on this original network of pipelines until, there is an energy transition finally. But this is not, because also the energy demands are sort of exploding. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. And this intertwining of pipelines and the stacking of pipelines and the flows of energy, that enable all sorts of other pipelines, connections, workflows, etc. That's hugely fascinating to me.
Yeah. Thanks. First of all, I think I should introduce a small correction. I wouldn't say that things like Nord Stream are connecting people. They are connecting rather non-human infrastructures, or maybe even in a way anti-human infrastructures, because they are connecting, in fact, like sort of gas fields in Yamal to factories here in Germany that result in climate catastrophe, and all of these things we know of well now. It is connecting an entity like the Russian Federation, so-called, and Germany, but it's not connecting people. If there are 2 people that this pipeline has connected, that's Putin and Schroeder, so in this sense it has connected 2 humans. Putin and Merkel, of course. Yeah, but also by way of connecting, it has disconnected a lot of things. So by connecting Russian Federation to Germany, it was supposed to disconnect Ukraine, for example. Yeah, and of course, one thing I would add is that I'm not advocating for the situation that was there before. That this role of Ukraine as a transit zone, when it was still connected, I mean, this was fundamentally wrong and problematic. Yeah, and it has caused great harm, not just to peace on this continent, but also environmentally and to Ukraine itself. Yeah, so of course, I would not like to live in the world where when we go to a sort of to a previous status quo, but of course this should rather be a world without this sort of infrastructures and without the need of this sort of infrastructures, and also therefore without a need for an entity such as the Russian Federation and its current regime, which is basically an outcome of this fossil fuel architecture.
I think we have time for one more question.
That's for Oleksiy. Could you talk a little bit about how the script for your film that's in the installation came about, and how it was written, and what were the sources?
Yeah, so this film is in the format of docu-fiction. So every single fact that is mentioned in the film is true. But the narrator is fictional. Yeah, still, even though the narrator is fictitious, it is based on research into on kind of institutional film history. Yeah, the history of this particular institution, and for example, the way not only its propaganda function and its participation in extractivist colonialism was playing out, but also, for instance, the gender situation in the film industry at the time, which tended to erase female filmmakers into either minor roles or uncredited roles, and so on. So it's based on the one hand on film archival kind of research into this history, and on the other hand on kind of putting together kind of real facts from the histories of these kind of three colonized regions, in parallel to the history of an actually existing film, called The White Reindeer of the Tundra. So it's a fiction film that was actually produced by the Science Film Studio, and you see images from this film again in our film. But the production process of this film, and actually the process of location scouting for this film, was kind of fictionalized. Yeah, so they are scouting the locations for the film that has actually been made, and all the facts about this really existing film are also, of course, true. So the actors from Uzbekistan who play indigenous peoples of the Arctic, it's true, it actually happened, and this film actually exists. Yeah, of course, and of course we would never have done this without our advisors, whom we unfortunately had to anonymize because they belong to indigenous communities in the lands currently occupied illegally by the Russian Federation, and unfortunately, had we exposed them, it would be extremely dangerous, not just for themselves, but also for their communities there. So, yeah, without this input, through which I also learned extremely a lot, and unlearn extremely a lot. First of all, unlearn, I should say. This would not be made. Yeah, the script would not be written, actually, and so the script is a result of a really long and kind of profound back and forth with our advisors.
Yeah, and we couldn't have done anything without Luba Knosov, who produced Oleksiy's film, but also parts of our films, and also without Svetlana Matvienko, who is our intellectual in chief. We follow everything she's writing about that. So you see, it's basically a sort of pool of research which we all share and contribute to, and none of it would be possible without the contribution of everyone in there.
Thank you so much for the inspiring talk. I would also like to thank our beautiful translators, to Vivi. Thank you so much. And also in the back, Bianca.